Have you ever noticed how many truly unique ideas never really get a chance to shine?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like something like 90% of those really original thoughts just never see the light of day.
Why do you think that is? What sets apart the ideas that actually take off from all the ones that get lost in the shuffle?
Well, I think that's exactly what Adam Grant digs into in Originals, and it's what we're going to try to unpack today. He's got a knack for looking at these things we think we know about success.
Right, like those assumptions we all have.
Exactly. And then he just flips the script on us with all this fascinating research.
And he does it in such an engaging way. Like, I was hooked from the intro by Sheryl Sandberg.
Oh, yeah, she wrote the foreword, right.
Yeah, and one of the things she talks about is this idea of strategic procrastination, like using it as a tool to be more creative.
Which totally goes against everything we're told about productivity and, getting things done right away.
I know, it's so counterintuitive, but it really got me thinking. Yeah, and that's what's so great about this book. It challenges those conventional ideas and makes you see things from a whole new perspective.
Totally. So today we're going to dive into Originals chapter by chapter. We'll pull out the key lessons and connect them to real-life stuff that you can actually use.
Because that's what matters, right? Being able to apply these ideas.
Exactly. So we'll look at why it's so important to question the status quo. All those times you find yourself thinking, well, that's just how it is.
Right, we just accept things without really thinking about them.
We'll also explore how to spot those truly original ideas, because it's not always easy.
And honestly, it's often harder than coming up with the ideas in the first place.
So true. And then there's the whole challenge of speaking truth to power, right? Like,
Yeah.
How do you voice your ideas when they go against the grain or you're talking to someone higher up?
Especially when you're worried about the consequences.
Exactly. We'll get into that too. And yes, we'll even touch on that surprising power of procrastination.
Because sometimes putting things off can actually be a good thing.
More than good, it can be strategic. But we're not talking about just being lazy.
No, it's about being deliberate and intentional with your time.
We'll also talk about how to build the right kind of support to make your ideas happen. So think of this deep dive as a toolkit for unlocking your own originality. Ready to get started with Chapter 1?
Definitely. Chapter 1 is all about creative destruction, the risky business of going against the grain. It sets the stage by introducing the idea that real originality often comes from challenging the norms, the things we just accept as given.
Okay, so let's break down this idea of challenging norms. One thing that struck me was how Grant points out that so many rules and systems in our world, they aren't like laws of nature. They were created by people.
It's true.
So that means they can be changed by people.
Right, and that's a really empowering thought. It means we have more agency than we might realize.
Exactly. He uses the example of women's suffrage to illustrate this. For so long, the idea that women couldn't vote was just accepted as the way things were.
But then the suffrage movement came along, and those activists started to see those laws differently.
Not as something set in stone.
Yeah, they realized these laws were the result of human decisions and could be changed through human action.
It's like that aha moment where you realize, wait a minute, we don't have to just accept this.
It's about recognizing the social origins of these defaults, that's just how things are done mentalities. And once you see that, it's like a whole new world of possibilities opens up.
It really makes you look around at your own life and work and think, what are the things I've been taking for granted? What could be different? Like, why do we always do things this way? Who decided that?
Right. It encourages you to question everything and start asking why more often.
And then the chapter gets into this fascinating topic of the trap of prodigies.
Yeah. So this part explores why those who achieve success early on don't always become the groundbreaking innovators we might expect them to be.
Right. Like you'd think early success would set them up to really shake things up later on.
But Grant argues that it can actually be a hindrance. He says child prodigies are often amazing at mastering existing systems. They learn the rules and excel at playing the game as it's defined.
But that can make it harder for them to question the rules themselves or to take those big risks that lead to real change.
Exactly. They get so good at working within the system that they might not see the need or even the possibility of transforming it.
It's like they become really skilled doctors who are brilliant at treating patients within the existing healthcare system.
But they might not question the system itself or advocate for radical new approaches to healthcare.
Or they might become amazing lawyers who know the law inside and out.
But they might be less likely to push for fundamental legal reform.
Even really effective teachers might find themselves stuck in this trap.
excelling at delivering the curriculum without ever questioning whether the curriculum itself is really serving the students.
It's almost like their early mastery creates this comfort zone where they focus on perfecting what they already know.
Instead of venturing out into uncharted territory.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and it makes you wonder if the way we celebrate and reward early achievement is actually setting some people up to be less original in the long run.
It's definitely something to think about. And this leads us to a great real-world example that Grant provides. The story of the founders of Warby Parker.
Oh yeah, those guys revolutionized the way we buy glasses.
Exactly. And their story perfectly illustrates how an original idea can face a ton of resistance early on. When they first shared their vision of selling glasses online, cutting out the traditional retail model, people were super skeptical.
I can imagine. It was a pretty radical idea at the time.
Right. People were like, if this was such a good idea, someone would have done it already. The common belief was that you had to try on glasses in person before buying them.
Plus, this was even before online shopping had really taken off.
Yeah.
I mean, Zappos was just starting to gain traction, but even that wasn't enough to convince people that glasses could be sold the same way.
And here's the kicker. None of the Warby Parker founders had any experience in the eyewear industry.
Or even in e-commerce, for that matter.
They were total outsiders, and yet they left behind their traditional career paths to pursue this idea that everyone thought was crazy.
It just goes to show you that sometimes not knowing the rules of an industry can be an advantage.
It's like their lack of experience freed them from the limitations and assumptions that everyone else had. They didn't know what they couldn't do, so they went ahead and did it.
It's a great reminder that sometimes being a bit naive can fuel originality. So once you have that potentially game-changing idea, what's next?
That brings us to Chapter 2, Blind Inventors and One-Eyed Investors, the art and science of recognizing original ideas. Here, the focus shifts from coming up with ideas to the often harder task of figuring out which ideas are actually worth pursuing.
Which is huge, because I think a lot of us get stuck in that brainstorming phase. We think if we can just come up with enough ideas, one of them is bound to be a winner.
But Grant makes a really good point. He says the biggest barrier to originality isn't a lack of ideas. It's our inability to pick out the truly promising ones.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality too.
Exactly. And he starts by talking about a very human tendency, overconfidence, especially among creators and entrepreneurs.
We all think our own ideas are brilliant, right?
It's natural. We get attached to our own creations and see them through rose-colored glasses. He even cites studies showing that small business owners consistently overestimate their chances of success.
It's hard to be objective about something you've poured your heart and soul into.
Totally. And Grant says this bias is even stronger in creative fields because a truly original idea is not definition unique. So it's easy to dismiss past failures or criticism as irrelevant.
It's like, well, those other ideas didn't work out, but this one is different.
Exactly. That perceived uniqueness makes it easy to ignore past data, even if it's relevant. So to counter this overconfidence, Grant emphasizes the importance of generating a huge volume of ideas.
Really? More ideas?
He points to people like Picasso, Maya Angelou, Einstein. They're known for a few iconic works, but those masterpieces represent just a tiny fraction of their total output.
Wow, so even the greats had tons of ideas that never saw the light of day.
Exactly. And by generating a large quantity of ideas, they increase their odds of hitting on those truly groundbreaking concepts. He quotes Ira Glass, who said, "The most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work, do a huge volume of work."
So it's not about agonizing over one perfect idea. It's about getting those creative juices flowing and exploring lots of possibilities.
It's like increasing your surface area for those moments of brilliance, those happy accidents.
Okay, but even with a ton of ideas, how do you know which ones will actually succeed?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And Grant talks about how often predictions fail, not just from creators, but from experienced executives and even from target audiences and market research.
So it's not like there's a magic formula for predicting success.
Not really. He talks about false negatives and false positives. False negatives are those amazing ideas that get rejected early on.
Like Seinfeld, nobody thought a show about nothing would work.
Exactly. It broke all the rules. And then you have false positives like the Segway.
Oh yeah, everyone thought that was going to be huge.
It generated so much hype, but ultimately it didn't live up to the expectations.
So why do these predictions fail so often?
Grant says executives and test audiences often get trapped by what he calls prisoners of prototypes and parochial preferences. They judge new ideas based on how closely they resemble existing successes. If something is too different, they focus on why it won't work instead of exploring its potential.
They're stuck in the familiar.
And on the flip side, creators themselves can be prone to false positives. They fall in love with their own ideas and become blind to the flaws.
So if neither creators nor traditional evaluators are always reliable judges, who do you turn to?
Grant makes a strong case for the wisdom of peers. Fellow creators in your field who can offer feedback on each other's ideas.
Because they understand the creative process.
And they're more open to unconventional thinking, so they're less likely to dismiss something just because it's different.
But they also don't have the same personal investment in your idea.
So they can offer a more objective assessment. It's like comedians valuing the feedback of other comedians. Or writers seeking feedback from other writers. They get it.
They speak the same language, but they're not blinded by their own ego.
Exactly. And Grant says we can also train ourselves to be better at spotting promising ideas, even if they're unusual. He talks about thinking more like creators ourselves instead of just focusing on practicality.
So being open to those seemingly impractical ideas and then applying a critical lens later on.
Right. It's about giving your imagination space to roam before you start focusing on limitations.
I like that. And then he ends the chapter with this cool example of Rick Ledwin, the NBC executive who championed Seinfeld.
Oh, yeah. He was the one who believed in the show even when everyone else was skeptical.
He wasn't a comedy writer himself.
Yeah.
But he had this intuitive understanding of what could be funny and original.
He trusted his gut and his understanding of comedy more than the initial negative feedback.
It's a great reminder that having champions within organizations who are open to unconventional thinking can make all the difference.
Absolutely. So let's say you've got this potentially original idea and you've gotten some positive feedback from your peers. What's the next hurdle?
Well, for a lot of people, it's the whole speaking truth to power thing, right? Having the courage to share your idea with someone who might not be receptive.
Definitely. And that's exactly what Chapter 3 tackles. It's all about out on a limb speaking truth to power.
This is such a common fear, especially if you're not in a position of authority yourself.
It can be super intimidating. And Grant starts by exploring how a lack of respect can poison the whole dynamic.
Like if a boss or someone higher up feels disrespected by their team?
Yeah, it can create this vicious cycle. He says when people in power feel like they're not respected, they can become more authoritarian, even abusive.
Thanks.
He actually shares this study where power holders who felt looked down on started assigning these really demeaning tasks to others.
Wow, that's messed up.
It's pretty disturbing. But it shows how important it is to have a foundation of mutual respect. If you want to create an environment where people feel safe sharing their ideas, even if they're different.
It's like that old saying, you get more bees with honey.
Exactly. And when it comes to championing a new idea, especially if you're not the boss, having that earned respect can make a huge difference.
That's where the concept of idiosyncrasy credits comes in, right?
Yeah. This is a really interesting idea. It basically says that within a group or organization, we build up these credits that allow us to deviate from the norm or express unconventional ideas without being penalized.
So it's like earning the right to be different.
In a way, yeah. And you earn these credits by demonstrating competence, loyalty, commitment to the group's goals.
So the more you prove your value within the system,
the more leeway you have to challenge it. Like the example Grant gives of male professors who start dressing more casually once they've established their academic reputation.
they've earned the right to be a little eccentric.
Exactly. But if you haven't built up those credits yet, rocking the boat can feel really risky. And Grant uses Carmen Medina's experience at the CIA to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah. She was trying to change the way information was shared within the agency.
Right, a very hierarchical and secretive organization. And her initial attempts to challenge the system from a lower position didn't go so well.
So she realized she needed to gain credibility first.
And she did this strategically. She took on a more traditional role in information security to demonstrate her competence.
It's almost like playing the game to eventually change the rules.
Exactly. It was a long-term strategy. And Grant calls this strategic conformity. Sometimes you need to work within the system for a while to gain the influence you need to eventually change it.
It's a clever approach. And then he talks about this really counterintuitive strategy for getting people on board with your ideas, highlighting the potential weaknesses.
The Sarek effect.
Right. It sounds crazy, but the example he gives is so interesting. It's about this guy, Rufus Griscom, who was pitching his startup Babel. And instead of just talking about how great it was, he started by listing the top 5 reasons not to invest.
He flipped the script.
Totally. And it worked. Because by acknowledging the potential downsides, he built trust with his audience. It made him seem more honest and transparent.
And it lowered expectations, which paradoxically made the strengths seem even more impressive.
It's like saying, hey, I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. Here's the good, the bad, and the ugly.
And people appreciate that kind of honesty. They feel like they're getting the full picture.
And it shows confidence, too. Like you're not afraid to acknowledge the challenges.
Exactly. And speaking of getting people on board, Grant talks about this psychological phenomenon called the mirror exposure effect.
Okay, what's that?
Well, basically, research has shown that the more we're exposed to something, whether it's a song, a face, an idea, the more we tend to like it.
So it's like familiarity breeds fondness.
Right. And this is really important when you're introducing a new idea. You can't just present it once and expect everyone to jump on board. You need to find ways to expose people to it repeatedly over time.
But you don't want to be too pushy either.
No, it's a delicate balance. Grant suggests keeping those initial presentations brief, maybe weaving your idea in with more familiar concepts, and allowing time for people to digest it before making a decision.
So it's a slow burn, not a hard sell.
Exactly. And then Grant throws in another curveball, the value of disagreeable people.
Disagreeable people. Wait, I thought being likable was always a good thing.
It usually is. But when it comes to championing truly original ideas, sometimes a little bit of disagreeableness can be an asset.
Really? How so?
Well, Grant's research suggests that highly agreeable people, while they're often well-liked, might be less likely to push for radical change.
Because they're so focused on keeping everyone happy.
Right. They want to avoid conflict and maintain harmony. So they might shy away from ideas that could rock the boat.
Whereas disagreeable people are more comfortable with confrontation.
Yeah. And they're more likely to challenge the status quo, even if it makes them unpopular. As one Google employee put it, they might have a bad user interface, but a great operating system.
That's a great analogy. So sometimes those prickly people can be the ones driving real innovation.
It's not always easy to work with them, but they can bring a valuable perspective.
It's interesting to think about the different personality types that contribute to originality. And then Grant also talks about this middle status conformity effect.
Which basically says that people in the middle of the hierarchy are often the least likely to speak up.
Really? Why is that?
They have more to lose than those at the bottom who might feel like they have nothing to risk. And they have less power than those at the top who are more secure in their position.
So they're stuck in this in-between zone where rocking the boat seems too dangerous.
They're focused on climbing the ladder and don't want to jeopardize their progress.
It makes sense, but it's also kind of sad because they might have some really valuable ideas that never get heard.
Definitely. And then there's the issue of gender and the additional challenges women often face when trying to voice their ideas.
This is such an important topic.
It is. And Grant talks about how women who speak up assertively are often perceived negatively. They're seen as aggressive or bossy.
While men who exhibit the same behaviors are praised for being strong leaders.
It's a classic double standard. And Grant cites research showing that women don't get the same recognition or rewards for contributing valuable ideas.
It's like they have to work twice as hard to be heard and taken seriously.
Which is incredibly unfair, and it creates a huge barrier to female originality.
So what can be done about this?
Well, Grant talks about the importance of actively challenging these stereotypes and creating a more inclusive environment where everyone feels safe sharing their ideas. He also shares some examples of women who have successfully navigated these challenges.
Like Donna Dubinsky, who worked at Apple.
Yes, she's a great example of someone who stood up for her ideas even when she was facing opposition from Steve Jobs.
Who was known for being pretty tough.
He was. But even Jobs respected people who had the courage to challenge him respectfully and intelligently. He actually had a habit of promoting people who pushed back effectively.
Which goes to show that even in a very hierarchical environment, dissent can be valued if it's done well.
It's about being assertive, but also respectful, and clearly articulating your reasoning.
And then Grant ends the chapter with this important point about voice versus exit.
He emphasizes that speaking up and trying to change a system from within isn't always the best approach.
Sometimes it's better to just walk away.
Exactly. If you're in an environment that's fundamentally resistant to your ideas, it might be more strategic to leave and find a better fit.
It's about recognizing when to fight and when to move on.
Right. And sometimes leaving can be the best way to protect your creativity and your sanity.
So you've identified an original idea. You've spoken truth to power, and maybe you've even decided to stay and fight for it, or maybe you've moved on to greener pastures. What happens next?
That takes us to Chapter 4. Fool's rush in timing, strategic procrastination, and the first mover disadvantage.
This is the one I've been waiting for. The chapter all about procrastination.
It's the one that caught Sheryl Sandberg's attention, too.
Because it's so counterintuitive. We're always told that we need to act fast, be the first mover strike while the iron is hot.
But Grant challenges that assumption. He argues that sometimes delaying action can actually be a strategic advantage.
And he calls this strategic procrastination.
Exactly. It's not about being lazy or avoiding work. It's about using delays intentionally to give your ideas time to develop and mature.
He gives the example of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I have a dream" speech. That iconic phrase wasn't in his original draft.
It came to him spontaneously during the speech itself, a moment of improvisation.
So in a way, his procrastination, or at least his willingness to deviate from the plan, allowed for that brilliant moment to emerge.
It's about finding that balance between the urgency to act and the potential benefits of letting ideas simmer for a while.
It's not always easy, but sometimes the best ideas come when we least expect them.
And this ties into Grant's discussion of the two life cycles of creativity. He draws on the work of David Gallinson, who identified two distinct types of creative individuals: conceptual innovators and experimental innovators.
Conceptual innovators are those who have their breakthrough moments early on, like Einstein or Orson Welles.
They come out of the gate with these brilliant ideas that change the world.
While experimental innovators, or late bloomers, tend to make their most significant contributions later in life.
Through a process of trial and error, constant experimentation.
Like Alfred Hitchcock or Robert Frost.
They refine their craft over time, building on their experiences and learning from their mistakes.
This is so encouraging for those of us who haven't had our big breakthrough yet.
It shows that originality isn't limited to the young. Grant even cites data showing that older employees often submit more and higher quality ideas.
And that the average age of successful startup founders is actually in their late 30s.
So there's hope for all of us late bloomers.
And for these experimental innovators, Grant says continuous experimentation is key. They're constantly trying things out, learning from their audience, gathering data.
It's an iterative process of refining their ideas over time.
Like Frank Lloyd Wright designing Falling Water when he was in his late 60s.
Or Raymond Davis Jr. winning the Nobel Prize for research that spans several decades.
It's amazing to see how originality can unfold over a lifetime.
And it makes you wonder if we sometimes judge people too quickly based on their early work.
Absolutely. And even the Warby Parker example could be seen as a form of strategic delay.
Right. They didn't rush their launch. They took their time to plan and test their model.
They were deliberate and strategic.
Which ultimately contributed to their success.
So we've explored how to generate ideas, recognize the good ones, speak truth to power, and even the power of procrastination. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
That brings us to Chapter 5. Goldilocks and the Trojan Horse creating and maintaining coalitions.
Okay, so now we're talking about building support for your ideas, bringing people together to make them happen.
Exactly. And this chapter is full of fascinating insights into the complexities of collaboration. One of the first things Grant talks about is this idea of the paradox of common goals.
Paradox of common goals. What's that?
It's the idea that while we often assume shared goals will unite people, they can also be a source of division.
Really? Why is that?
Well, because even when people agree on the big picture, they might disagree on the specifics.
Like how to achieve those goals.
Exactly. And this can lead to what Grant calls horizontal hostility, conflict between groups that are actually on the same side.
So you're telling me that even when everyone wants the same thing, they can still end up fighting with each other?
It happens all the time. Grant gives the example of the women's suffrage movement. They were all fighting for the same goal.
Oh,
the right for women to vote.
But they had different ideas about how to achieve that goal.
And they ended up splitting into factions, which weakened the movement as a whole.
It's almost like that saying about too many cooks in the kitchen.
It's more like too many cooks with slightly different recipes. And Grant ties this back to Freud's observation about the narcissism of small differences.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
It's the idea that people are often most hostile towards those who are most similar to them.
Because those small differences feel like a threat to their identity or their way of doing things.
Exactly. So even within a group that shares a common goal, those minor disagreements can become major sources of conflict.
Fascinating. And then Grant introduces this idea of ambivalent allies, which is another counterintuitive concept.
It is. He says that sometimes those relationships that are a mix of positive and negative interactions can be more valuable than those that are purely positive.
You mean like your frenemies?
Exactly, because those ambivalent allies are more likely to give you honest feedback, even if it's critical.
They're not just going to tell you what you want to hear.
And their eventual support means more because it signifies that your idea has passed a tougher test.
It's like they've seen the flaws and they still believe in it.
And this ties into the research that shows that former adversaries can be the most persuasive allies.
Because they've seen the other side of the argument.
And they've made a conscious decision to come over to yours.
That's powerful. And then there's this really clever strategy that Grant calls the Trojan horse strategy.
Which is all about making your original idea more palatable by disguising it as something familiar.
So it's like sneaking it in under the radar.
Exactly. He gives the example of how Disney pitched The Lion King to studio executives.
Which was a pretty unconventional animated movie at the time.
They framed it as Hamlet on the Savannah.
That's brilliant. It gave the executives a familiar reference point and made the idea seem less risky.
And it worked. The Lion King became a huge success.
It's a great reminder that sometimes you need to meet people where they are and package your ideas in a way that makes sense to them.
And Grant also emphasizes the importance of tailoring your pitch to your specific audience.
So the same idea might need to be presented differently to different groups.
Depending on their values, beliefs, and concerns.
He uses the example of the suffragists who were trying to convince the Women's Christian Temperance Union to support their cause.
The WCTU was a powerful organization, but they weren't initially interested in women's suffrage.
So the suffragists had to find a way to frame their argument in a way that would resonate with the WCTU's values.
And they did this by emphasizing how giving women the right to vote would help them protect their homes and families.
Which aligned with the WCTU's focus on social reform and moral uplift.
It was a brilliant strategy. And it worked. The WCTU became a powerful ally in the fight for women's suffrage.
It's a great example of how understanding your audience is key to building support for your ideas.
And finally, Grant talks about the role of shared tactics in building coalitions.
So it's good to have some common ground, some shared methods for working together.
But he says that too much overlap can actually be a disadvantage.
Really?
Because it reduces the diversity of perspectives and skills within the coalition.
So it's better to have some unique strengths that complement each other.
Exactly. And he also notes that alliances tend to be more successful when there's some difference in status among the groups involved.
So it's not just about finding people who agree with you. It's about finding people who can bring something different to the table.
And who have different levels of influence and resources.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. From questioning the status quo, to identifying original ideas, to speaking truth to power, to embracing strategic procrastination, to building coalitions. It's been an incredible journey through Adam Grant's originals.
It has. And I hope you found some valuable insights that you can apply to your own life and work.
I know I have. To recap some of the key takeaways, remember the power of peer feedback.
Your peers can offer a more objective and nuanced perspective than you might be able to see on your own.
Also, don't underestimate the value of strategic procrastination.
Give your ideas time to breathe and evolve. You might be surprised at what emerges.
And finally, remember that highlighting the weaknesses of your idea can actually make it stronger.
It builds trust and shows that you're not afraid to acknowledge the challenges.
So as you go about your week, I encourage you to think about these concepts. Are there any defaults in your life or work that you've been accepting without question? Are you actively seeking feedback from your peers on your ideas? And how could you apply the Trojan horse strategy to make your original ideas more palatable to others?
And here's a final thought to leave you with. As technology advances and artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, what role will human originality play in the future? How can we cultivate those uniquely human skills, the ability to ask the tough questions, to connect the dots, to build bridges between people in a world where machines are taking on more and more of the cognitive tasks? It's a question worth pondering as we continue to explore the power and potential of being original.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.